Yeah.
Right, straight on with the show. And the first one is something that's probably a couple of weeks old, in relation to the Dominic Cummings WhatsApp, in which he identified the incompetence of our dear Health Secretary, Matthew Hancock, and how the Prime Minister himself perceives Matthew Hancock, and it's not very positively. But obviously what we've seen since then is the attempt to cover it up. I mean, Matthew Hancock came on TV the other day and said, oh, he thought that those comments were made under stress. You know, he was under duress, and a lot of things were going on and all that sort of stuff. So they know you've got that, and you've got Boris Johnson coming out and saying, "Oh, you know, don't listen to Dominic Cummings. Don't take anything that he says seriously, so to speak, and it's all a load of rubbish." What a shame that Boris Johnson and particularly didn't have that perception in mind when he employed Dominic Cummings for well over a year, on the back of his successful campaign.
Did you say deceitful?
Yes, I did say yes. Sorry, yes, yeah. I must check my spelling. In relation to his successful, deceitful campaign to orchestrate. And I'm saying this not somebody who's a Remainer or a Reliever. I'm just saying this as somebody who recognises reality when he sees it, when it's, you know, brimming with evidence, in terms of the referendum campaign. So, you know, Dominic Cummings was the golden boy until he wasn't. And then when he wasn't, he's more Attila the Hun. And Attila the Hun probably, you know, laying into this government for millions of people would probably be a welcome sight. But we're not going to focus too much. I mean, I know you want to have a quick word about the WhatsApp messages, Tom, but we focus less upon Dominic Cummings and Matthew Hancock and Boris Johnson's spat, and more on a phrase that you sort of coined: who do we allow to die, based on the whiteboard. So if you can just, you know, explain that a little bit further.
Yeah, well, it wasn't a phrase I coined. It was written on the Downing Street whiteboard. So what the thing I wanted to particularly pick up on, and it's been sort of in my mind constantly over the last couple of weeks, is this image that amongst the WhatsApp messages that Cummings has released, you know, proving that what he said, some of which proves what he said was true, you know, that there was this image of a whiteboard with wording on, obviously discussions that they were having at Downing Street. Now, people have focused very much, and to some extent rightly so, people have focused on him revealing and releasing the WhatsApp messages between him and Boris Johnson, revealing Johnson describing back last March at the very start of the pandemic, revealing that his health secretary that will be in charge of the response to the pandemic was effing hopeless. Those were Johnson's words, and he's backed that up by releasing the actual WhatsApp messages. And people are focused on that, and understandably so. If, you know, right at the start of the pandemic, Johnson was saying that Hancock was hopeless, effing hopeless, and was considering replacing him with Gove, and then didn't. And since then, Hancock has been found in court to have lied about things and to have acted unlawfully, and Johnson has still stood by him. Then obviously people are very right to question why that is, especially as we're 150,000 deaths down the line through their incompetence and negligence. But it keeps coming into my mind that actually the focus should really be far more on what was in the bottom right hand corner of that whiteboard. And it was, the question was written on the whiteboard: who do we not save? And yes, at the time that it was released, you know, there was some outrage about that, you know, to a small extent, from opponents of the government. But it's not something that's been particularly discussed, widely discussed, regularly discussed. And And I keep finding that staggering, because who do we not save as a question that the government are posing is really staggering when you think about it. Another way of saying who do we not save is who do we allow to die? Quite simply, who do we allow to die? Now, can you imagine, viewers, can you imagine if that were a Labour government? Imagine a Corbyn-led Labour government, and they're found on a whiteboard in Downing Street during a pandemic to have written, who do we not save, or who do we allow to die? There would be widespread, massive national media and public calls for the whole government to resign, especially once 150,000 odd people had died, especially when we're finding that a large proportion of people hospitalized in care homes, people who are perfectly well but have a learning disability, had do not resuscitate orders placed on their medical records, often without discussion with them or their families. An absolute disgrace, something that hopefully will be thoroughly investigated, and how those DNR orders came to pass, came to be decreed, will be uncovered. And I hope people go to prison over that. It's a really shocking aspect of the pandemic that hasn't been fully uncovered yet.
But
Yeah.
can I just say at this point, big but so many things have been revealed over the last 18 months going on, and nothing has been done. We've had minister after minister standing in front of cameras, butting and umming and lying, misrepresenting, whatever, but nothing's been done. And then we talk about an inquiry. Well, we've had so many inquiries in the past about a whole range of things, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, Grenfell. I mean, we can go back through time and just look at so many different inquiries. The first report we keep talking about in terms of institutional racism in the Met, but nothing really ever changes. It's just a lip service. So the chances of us ever having a government minister, let alone a prime minister, but a government minister being found guilty in the courts and sent to prison are they're zilch.
Or even being held to account in any meaningful
or even
way.
being held to properly account. So are we really wasting our time, Tom, in pointing all these things out sometimes when we know full well that the establishment will pull together, power will pull together, the corrupt will pull together and ensure that if there is a patsy, they'll throw them to the wind, but ultimately most of them will carry on their super yachts, living a luxurious lifestyle, and generally urinating above on the rest of us.
Absolutely, and part of that is because currently the Conservatives have an 80-seat majority, and control over not just government but all sorts of aspects that should act as a sort of check and balance on authoritarian power, but aren't, because they've attacked and undermined those checks and balances in an authoritarian way. But also primarily because the vast majority of media, especially print media, is owned by billionaires that support the Conservatives in what they're doing because they don't like paying much tax, apart from other reasons.
But even outside of that,
yeah.
if you look at Blair and his centrists in 2003, 2004, they lied to the nation, and they lied probably on behalf of George Bush and the CIA and the Pentagon, etc. They lied to the nation. And the carnage that they created as a result in Iraq and Afghanistan far outweighs anything that Saddam Hussein, as bad as he was, and Colonel Gaddafi did. And yet both of those were eliminated, shall we say, They didn't even end up in court. They didn't end up on trial. They didn't go to The Hague. They were eliminated because they were people that we certainly couldn't put in the dock because of what they would reveal and the debate that would create globally. So they have their ways and means of eliminating these people. Yet many, many people have been calling for the likes of Blair and Bush to end up in The Hague for the last 15 odd years. And yet the chances of it happening again are zilch.
Yeah, you're right. But I'm going back to your initial point, you know, is it pointless us, you know, raising these issues and hoping for inquiries or things to actually get truth and justice and accountability for politicians' actions? You're right that no doubt, you know, inquest, investigation, whatever into the government's pandemic response, coordinated by the government, will more or less completely exonerate them of you know, causing deaths through their actions or being negligent or anything. And certainly individual politicians, especially high up, will not be found accountable for anything. But all of that doesn't mean that we shouldn't highlight these things. And of course, we know that we're battling against a very right-wing media that's you know, that supports this government's actions. And all we can do through doing things like, you know, through having publications, you know, independent citizen media like Dorset Eye, is to allow different viewpoints to be shared. And the point of having 10 by 6 is hopefully some of the viewers will start to think, well, yeah, that message on our government's, in 10 Downing Street, on our government's whiteboard, was a thing that said, who do we not save? Which means, who do we allow to die? Our government were discussing that at the start of the pandemic. Who do we allow to die? And then some of their actions come into a bit more sort of focus when you know that that's the basis of their discussions.
I think absolutely. I agree with you totally, Tom. I think we have a absolute duty to reveal reality. But that wasn't my point. I think my point was more about the hope that we have that the people who are responsible will face justice. I think that it's that last bit where we actually want to see people who have lied, who are corrupt, who've been incompetent in positions of power, have abused that power, to be held responsible. And like you said, they very, very, very rarely are now.
No.
They pretty much, and in fact they do, as we saw with Blair, and as we've seen with Matthew Hancock, as we've seen with Boris Johnson, they get away with at least manslaughter. And for many people, as you rightly pointed out, who do we allow to die? It's a premeditated, which means it's more in the scope of murder.
Absolutely.
But it's, I mean, not just yeah. Sorry, no, I was just going to say and it doesn't just start here, does it? I mean, if we go to this quote from Bill Bryson, where he sums it up perfectly, that all the rubbish that we've been fed by the Conservative government since 2010, if we just go to 2000 and the turn of into 2020 with the constant repetitive propaganda, we were told that the NHS in this country is ready for the COVID pandemic. And yet, when we look at the effect of 10 years of austerity leading up to the pandemic, we know factually, empirically, that they again are lying to us. He says, on the other hand, it is possible to spend too little, and Britain certainly seems determined to lead that category among high-income nations. Britain comes 35th out of 37 wealthy countries for number of CT scanners per person. Well, we've seen how important scanners have been. 31st out of 36 for MRI scanners, and 35th out of 41 for number of hospital beds per size of population. Well, in a time of a pandemic, what do you need more than hospital beds? Very little. The British Medical Journal reported in early 2019 that cuts to health and social care budgets between 2010 and 2017, the year when Jeremy Corbyn almost became elected Prime Minister, led to about 120,000 early deaths in the UK, a pretty shocking finding. So if you add the 120,000 early deaths, plus the 150,000 people that have died as a result of COVID, and we do have the highest death rate on the planet per population, what we find is that well over 250,000 people have died in this country unnecessarily as a direct result of Tory government mismanagement and austerity measures based on an ideology that's been long since proven not to be effective or efficient.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it's extremely scary that, and you made the point earlier about the people who are most vulnerable in relation to who should we allow to die, are also the people who don't engage with social media, who spend very little time researching other than watching the 6 o'clock news bulletin, who know very little. And in going back to what you were saying earlier about having the information in a democracy and being aware, and yet they were the ones who were put out to pasture by the Conservative government from the very outset as being the ones that we didn't have to prioritise in terms of saving. So I wonder if they had that information, if they all had that information and they're all clued up and skilled up and tooled up in terms of understanding what it means to be in a democracy and to be the recipient of abuses of power, whether they would still whether they're so likely to put their X next to a Conservative candidate in a ballot box.
Well, I hope so, Jason. I hope that, all people, not just people in those sort of categories, if you like, sort of vulnerable categories, but I hope all people will recognise what this government have been doing. Will recognise that, they've been making choices that have led to, as you say, due to austerity measures and due to their appalling pandemic response, led to over 250,000 early deaths. And there's an answer to their question. Who do we not save? Who do we allow to die? Which, just to reiterate, I'm absolutely convinced that if it were a Labour government and that image of the whiteboard with that question on it, who do we not save? If that had been a Labour government, every single newspaper, and in particular, all the right-wing newspapers, the billionaire-owned corporate media, the Sun, the Mail, the Express, the Times, the Telegraph, they would all have that image and that question on the whiteboard on their front page, and they would be calling for resignation. They would say, resign now, you must go, without a doubt. And yet, because it's a Conservative government, they've hardly covered it. It's staggering. Our government were discussing who do they choose not to save the lives of? And we have an answer to that question. The answer is the poorest people, the elderly, the vulnerable, those with comorbidities, those who are already have one or more illnesses, and the economically unproductive. In other words, the more costly to society. They've said, yeah, those people, the pensioners, the old folk, the ill, the infirm, those with learning disabilities, they're the ones that we're choosing not to save. That was their answer.
I think that's a good place to stop. And I think our primary hope maybe is that there should be a lot more wokes who wake up and start to understand and start to realise what's being done, not just in their name, but being done to them and their families. And they should respond appropriately. And I think by responding appropriately, it means that they don't put an X next to a political party that's effectively going to murder them.